Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. Have you heard of Sandra Smith, Dr. James Waller, Dr. Michael Nathan, Bill Sampson, or Caesar Cause? Here's a hint. In 1979, they all participated in a civil rights and workers' rights rally in Greensboro, North Carolina. Nothing? How about this? During the march, with local TV cameras filming, a caravan of Klansmen and Neo-Nazis jumped out of cars and shot all 5 dead. And after 2 trials, no one was convicted of the murders. Let's discuss the Greensboro Massacre. We are glad to have a very special guest, Aran Shetterly, to talk about his new book, Morningside. Welcome, Aran. Where are you at now? East Coast? Is that right?
Yeah, I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia, which connects in a funny way to this story. If you remember what happened in 2017
Oh, oh
with the
gosh,
Unite the Right rally here, right? Uh,
that's right. And well, Greg's in Pittsburgh. I'm in Tacoma, and it's a
ah,
beautiful day in Tacoma. Let me get a little background about you. I've been using Deep Seek, and this is what Deep Seek says says about you. They rave about your book Americano: Fighting for Castro's Cuba's Freedom. And that was a book where you were looking at a one individual in depth, William Morgan, and his relationship to Castro and Che. Tell us a little bit about that book before we get into your current book.
sure. Yeah, he was the vehicle for that story. This guy named William Morgan from Toledo, Ohio. I was in uh, Cuba in 2001 and on a trip to look at Cuban art, and which I was interested in. And that we had this presentation about how the Cuban government worked. And I had studied the Spanish Civil War. And I said, were there any foreigners who came here to fight, like they went to Spain to fight fascism in the 30s? This guy said, no, but there was this one guy. What was his name? And his secretary said, William Morgan. And I got this little tingle. And I came back and sent a FOIA request to the CIA, got this big stack of documents, about 2/3 of which were redacted. And I thought, here I go. I got to know what's under there. But it ended up being a real way to retell actually the history of that revolution and how
Mhm.
much more interesting and complex it was than what we're generally taught. And Morgan ended up in this sort of gray area between, the Castro side and the Miami side, fighting for a kind of social democracy and losing.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a fascinating book. I'll put it on my Kindle list. But we're talking about this book, Morningside, and this is something I was quite ashamed of because I didn't know anything about I didn't know anything about this. And this is a huge part of our history. The 1979 Greensboro Massacre and the struggle for an American city's soul. This is in honor, we're having you on in honor of Black History Month, which is Gerald Ford proclaimed that in 1976. This is a civil rights story. And you started off by saying that you were in close to Charlottesville, Virginia, and this is a very similar story. Tell us about Morningside. Where is Morningside? What's the story about the massacre in '79?
So, like you, I'd never heard of this history. And in 2015, I was in Greensboro, uh, North Carolina, and because my father had a show of his paintings at the International Civil Rights Center and Museum there. And the woman who organized that said, there are 2 people here you have to meet. So we went over to this little cafe, and in walked Reverend Nelson Johnson and his wife, Joyce Johnson. And they proceeded to tell us an outline of this history, which how in the 70s, I mean, they were civil rights activists, Black Power activists, Pan-Africanists, and eventually ended up in a multiracial communist group called the Workers' Viewpoint Organization, and then the Communist Workers' Party, organizing in what were still some of the biggest textile mills in the world in the that north part of North Carolina. I mean, all the Levi's dungaree jean material came from Greensboro, North Carolina for about 100 years. And they were trying to bring white and black workers together to build stronger unions and were having trouble. So they thought the Klan, yeah, we were talking about the late 70s, but the Klan was interfering with their work, probably with the tacit support of management. And they decided to hold a big rally to educate workers, black and white, about why they needed to come together and how they would have more power if they did. And so they were setting up beautiful Saturday morning, November 3rd, 1979, um, putting up posters, singing some songs, getting ready, and all of a sudden a caravan of Klansmen and Nazis drives up, picks a fight, starts shooting, and 88 seconds later, there are 5 people dead, 10 injured, and no one is ever held criminally responsible for what happened that day. And I thought, wow, how do I not know about this? And this is a story that really needs to be told. But when I walked out of that cafe motivated me was these amazing 2 people I'd been sitting with. Here they were still in the struggle all these years later. They were not cynical. They were loving. They were optimistic, well, hopeful, let's say. And they had never stopped fighting for justice, fighting for poor and marginalized people in Greensboro and North Carolina and this whole country. And I was in awe.
Greg, let me bring you into this. Before you came on, Aaron, Greg and I were chatting. Greg's in Pittsburgh, and in '79, he just dropped out of his graduate program in philosophy and was very involved with the similar activities in Pittsburgh with the Communist Party in Pittsburgh.
Hmm.
Greg, fill us in some background of
Well,
how these times are sort of the same for you in the north, east, and the south here.
my first experience, and maybe only experience with North Carolina, my daughter lives there now, but uh, was the Wilmington 10. I was a part of the National Association, the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, a group that was formed um, nationally after the Angela Davis campaign in the 19 around 1970, and around 72, the Wilmington 10 was the cause célèbre for most people in the support in the solidarity movement
Yeah.
nationally. And so I was in Wilmington, North Carolina, I think in 70, I think it was 72, as a big demonstration. Angela Davis spoke there. That was my only familiarity with the area, but I knew I knew from our activities, our work, and my later engagement with the Communist Party, the real Communist Party, not the CWP, that organizing in the South is an incredible thing. It's an incredibly difficult thing. I tip my hat to anyone who wants to try to do it, particularly any radicals that want to do it, even today, but they have to do it with their eyes wide open, an assessment of the moment, of the times, and of the forces that come to bear. CWPers were in Pittsburgh as well. There was a small group here that they were doing what party members, Communist Party members, did in the 20s and 30s and 40s and are doing again today, and that is salting. They were going into industrial areas and trying to get jobs and trying to be involved and engaged in building unions and militancy. So I tip my hat to it, but it really was the wrong time, the wrong place, misassessment of the balance of forces in so many ways. But they were dedicated people, just probably not. Well, you can say the party was created in what, 1977 or 78. So, and it was done in 85, it was long gone. So there were many parties like that occurred in that period.
Absolutely.
Maoism was a rage, really a rage on the left. And
Hmm.
if you were a college student, you didn't want to be involved with the Communist Party. They're too involved. They believe in workers and all that. You wanted something really radical like Maoism. And so there was the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Communist Workers' Party, Communist Labor Party, and so on and so forth. They're all
Yeah.
associated with Maoism, RU, Revolutionary Union. And they came and they went. But this was a tragic, tragic, tragic moment. I mean, just a tragic moment in terms of what was going on at that
Well,
time.
yeah,
And
I mean, to your point, I mean, there are a couple interesting things I'd love to pick up on what you just said. One is, you know, it had, in some ways, you could argue that this massacre really spelled the end of the ultra left,
Yeah.
movement, right? In a way, right? It was such a chilling and terrifying event, and not only that, you know, what I discovered as I dug into this was that the FBI investigation around the Greensboro Massacre was one of the largest in the nation's history. Well, it wasn't the largest FBI or one of the largest FBI investigations to solve what had happened. It was to harass this group and others like it out of existence. And they were very successful at that in a lot of ways. So if they weren't scared by the shooting, they were terrified by the surveillance and the presence of law enforcement in every aspect of their lives for years after that. Um, but that Angela Davis moment that you were present for, when I think it's around then that she called North Carolina a laboratory for racism in the South, right?
Mhm.
And and the tactics they used to jail the Wilmington 10, and who was involved in that. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms was very involved in putting those people away. And they come up again, a few years later here in the Greensboro Massacre, that they're also involved in basically subverting the activism that's going on there. One of the things that interested me about this particular case and why I focused on the Johnsons was because the Johnsons already had a long history of grassroots and successful grassroots organizing in Greensboro. And they had brought together this alliance there through the Communist Workers' Party of, white and black, but also, Jewish and Latino and a number of different people in this group. And it was interesting to see in the mistakes they made, right? Of baiting the Klan and being naive about, what could happen to them and whether the police would actually protect them or not.
Yeah.
That, in a sense, the people who had been on the ground for a long time there, in a sense, fell into that, right? This sort of heady,
Yeah.
revolutionary attitude. And what was really particularly tragic about that is a lot of that was being pushed from outside Greensboro, from New York, be militant, be strong, and I think it created a distortion that led to obviously something tragic.
I'd like to talk about these various people that were killed, but and you know, it
Yeah,
goes to the point that you're making with this. I'll put this up on the screen, but here are the Greensboro, the 5 people that were killed that day,
yeah,
and Sandra Smith, or Sandy Smith, was a union organizer. Started with the student black unity movement. Like you were saying, Greg, there were a lot of these movements that were springing up around this time. Dr. James Waller was a president of the local textile. He got his medical degree from University of Chicago. There were 2 doctors that were shot. Um, the Bill Sampson was a Harvard Divinity School graduate, who also didn't he start medical
at the
school too?
University of Virginia, he dropped out to become part of the Communist Workers' Party.
Yeah, and then Caesar Chauce, am I pronouncing that
Kause,
right?
Kause.
Cauce
Hmm.
was a magna cum laude graduate from Duke University, focusing in mathematics, and
And a
just
PhD student there. Yeah.
and then Dr. Michael Nathan, chief pediatric at Lincoln Community Health Center in Durham, North Carolina. These were idealistic, very bright people who
Brilliant.
were giving up a lot to express their frustration of the poor conditions at the time in Greensboro. And this is before neoliberalism literally blew up. Tell me about your impression about the quality of these people as far as their intellectual prowess and their commitments and their focus.
I mean, these, to be honest with you, are some of the best and the brightest. I mean, these are really smart, talented, dedicated people. And when you look also beyond, and I want to come back to the 5, but when you look beyond them into the larger CWP, we have, you know, best-selling authors, best-selling physics author in the United States, a former mayor of Oakland, a former deputy mayor of New York, on and on. I mean, the people involved there were extremely talented and smart, and idealistic, as you said. Uh, you know, the doctors in the group like to tell this little parable, right? That uh, they were in their visiting rooms, right? Their consulting, and people would come in. They keep coming in with broken legs. And they keep fixing it. And they come out. They come back, and the leg would be broken again. So eventually, they look out and say, "Oh, there's a big hole out there. Why am I sitting in here, fixing the leg every time it's broken? I better go out and fill that hole." And so, to your point, these people left, comfortable careers that they could have just gone along and made money and had a big house or a comfortable house, and instead, left that behind and went into work in, menial jobs, often starting from the bottom in these mills, and trying to organize people there to come together.
And Greg, we've had several. I mean, you were the one who educated me with this, with how the Communist Party was so involved with the union movement back in the late 60s, early
Well,
70s.
to
All the
be a
author, how many
communist,
authors have we had on that? That's the central
one of
theme.
the things left out of this conversation is to be a communist requires one ingredient that many of these people don't have, and that's humility. I mean, I was in a PhD program as well, but I moved into the communist movement because I met workers. I met workers that were communist and had devoted their life to a cause and suffered far more to get to where they were than upper middle class people that made these sacrifices. And I agree, they made enormous, and they still are. And on our left today, they're the same kinds of people that are idealistic, have a world in front of them, and devote themselves to movements and militancy. The tragedy is that they don't pause and talk and immerse themselves in the working class movement, not to bring their valuable resources to workers in a patronizing way, but to be part of the working class. I mean, I was fortunate enough to grow up in the working class and then get into higher education. And I really wasn't interested in becoming a communist, but I met people like I grew up with who dedicated their life and went through McCarthyism and lost their spouses and their children were alienated and lost jobs and suffered. Not the celebrities, but the workers. And I thought, I can't separate myself from that legacy. And I listened to them. I read about all the Marxist stuff in the world, but I took my education from a retired coal miner in Western Pennsylvania who was a communist. I listened to what the labor theory of value was from someone that knew what it was.
Right.
It's at the coal face. So I don't mean to demean. I'm not trying in any way to diminish these sacrifices. A sacrifice is a sacrifice, but there's a tragedy to it. That's the element I look at is the tragedy of going in and knowing everything. I know, that's why you leave a profession, drop everything, and
Well,
you think you're on the verge of revolution because the Vietnamese won in 76, 75, the Portuguese colonies were liberated in the late 70s. And what's around the corner? Reaganism.
in response to that, what I'd say a couple things. One is one of the reasons that I focused the book on the Johnsons is that they were working class people. They were salt of the earth people who came out of that. Their activism started there. It got away into this other thing, and then they returned to that. And so I wanted to see that whole arc. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And they are embedded in the community in the way you're talking. They are of that community. And that was extremely important to me. If honestly, if there hadn't been this later act in which they brought that circle back, I don't know that I would have written this book, because it's that later act that gives hope, that shows strength, that shows maturing, that shows, all of these things that you're talking about. The other thing that I think is important, if you're in a tradition with the CPUSA, for example, you've got generations of people and sharing information across generations, right? And wisdom and cautionary tales and victories, whatever they are. These people were also young. They were so young. I mean, when I think of myself, if I'd been in that organization in my 20s, you know what I mean, or early 30s, I would have gotten caught up in that energy and the sense of my own immortality and my sense of, the possibility of things that probably wouldn't have been realistic. I did things like that.
Sure.
So I think that when you have a bunch of people all the same age and they're all young doing this together, they can work themselves into a froth.
And still are. And they
Yeah,
still are.
and still do. Yeah.
And Nelson Johnson Beloved Community Center is still there and still
It's still there.
it's
Yeah,
still
and
there
it's
and still working and he's a pastor, correct?
he is he's very sick right now, so it's a sad moment, but I spent years with him when he was still extremely vibrant.
Right.
And the thing is, their beloved community center right there, off of downtown Greensboro by the train tracks. Um, it really is like an alternate city hall, that people come to talk about ideas and possibilities that aren't going to necessarily get talked about in the official city hall, and they have influence.
I'll post a link to them, and that's
Please,
so
that would be
people
wonderful.
can do that. Okay, so let's get. We haven't really told the story yet of what happened that day. Let's
Right.
start with this here, and I'm holding up a flyer, and the flyer says "Death to the Klan: Anti-Klan March and Conference, Saturday, November 3rd, 1979, Greensboro, North Carolina." They were organizing a protest march that day. Fill us in, start the story with this.
What was true was that the Klan was rising in the South at this time. There have been incidents in Alabama and Mississippi, in Georgia. Uh, it was post-Vietnam. The economy was a mess, right? Interest rates really high. And the Klan is sort of feeling restless, and people are moving toward a white supremacist, white nationalist movement again.
What year is this?
Late 70s,
Yeah, I
77,
know.
78,
Are you talking about? Oh, I thought you were talking about today.
79.
You
Yeah.
could be
Yeah,
talking about.
exactly. No, there's so many parallels, right? I mean, there's so many parallels. And
Yeah.
uh and so these guys, there had been a Klan rally a few months earlier in a little town called China Grove, about 70 miles from Greensboro. And they were a recruiting effort. And they were going to show Birth of a Nation, that 1915 racist film, uh, in order to recruit people. And the Communist Workers' Party went down and talked to the community there, the black community, and they did not want this to happen, but they didn't know what to do. So they said, well, we'll come and we'll lead a march. And so about 50 CWP members came down, and about 50 people or so from the community marched, and they marched up to this little tiny community center where they were screening Birth of a Nation, and they shut it down. And these guys were standing with automatic weapons on the porch, but there were 2 or 3 policemen there who basically told the Klansmen and Nazis to go back inside. And they did. Well, the CWP thought this was a major victory. And they thought, wow, if we can show how cowardly the Klan is, right, it'll bring people to our movement, perhaps. And so they decided to take the next step and organize this march in order to really assert themselves as the people fighting white supremacy in the South. And so the Klan didn't like what had happened. They were talking, but the police department in Greensboro then asked this former Klansman and former FBI informant named Eddie Dawson to go down and figure out what the Klan's going to do about this. So Eddie Dawson, the police informant, goes down to a big Klan meeting, about 80 people in the room, and says, it's your patriotic duty to go to Greensboro and confront these communists. How many people are going? 80 people put their hands up. Someone says, can we bring guns? I'm not your daddy, but bring your bond money if you do. And 40 people do. So Eddie goes back and tells the cops that Klansmen are going to come and they're probably going to be armed. he didn't say he'd rallied them to do it. So then the cops come up with this brilliant strategy that they're going to have a low profile approach to the march, no cops in sight. So when these guys drive up, the cops know they're coming. They know they're probably going to be armed, and there's not a single cop there that day. So that's what happened. And that's sort of the complicated piece at the heart of this story is it wasn't just Klan versus communists. The state was involved.
And that theme is apparent with our Black Lives Matter, where when the violence broke out, the police just tended to be in the back and didn't tend to get as involved. So
It's a great antidote. I mean, the story is a great antidote to this worshipful idea people have today of the FBI and the security forces in general. And it's just amazing to me. I mean, when you know this history that you present or that you present to people, how people can believe that, could be so gullible as to believe they're your friend. I mean, they've always been on the wrong side of the security people, the FBI. But today the FBI is romanticized. You know, it's ugly. But yeah, I think the CWP thought this was a John Brown moment.
right,
And
right.
that's the tragedy of it to my mind. It wasn't a John Brown moment, but the real story here is the collaboration of the police in this whole
Exactly. That's the
ultimate.
real story.
That's the
You know,
real
the thing is,
story.
the CWP made a mistake, but a mistake isn't criminal, right? They had a permit. The police were supposed to be there to protect them. That was just they went through proper channels to get that march done, you know?
This was
Uh,
a little provocative.
no, it's totally provocative. That's a
It
mistake.
probably could have rethought this maybe a
Oh,
little bit.
But you don't deserve to die because you make a mistake.
yeah,
I mean, that's
Right.
exact. That's my point. You know, you can make a mistake and not die. You can make a mistake and still deserve to be protected, by law enforcement.
all of us have lost our temper and put ourselves in a situation we regret later with our temper or our words, but you don't deserve to die for that. I mean, that's just
Exactly.
that's
Yeah.
So
that's it's tragic.
so they're marching into Greensboro, and all of a sudden the Klan drive their car through, through where the right by where the marchers are, and tell us what happens next.
Well, I interviewed this cameraman. So what's also interesting and is another link to today and how these things play out is the whole thing's on film. There were
I
4 camera crews there,
I'm gonna
right?
link I'm gonna link this, Aaron. When you watch this film, they are just it's just amazing to see people jump out of a car and take guns out and kill people, get in the car and leave, and it's all right there.
You can watch it on YouTube. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
geez.
I mean, um, and it's like it's a turkey shoot. They're just calmly getting their guns, loading them, shooting. I mean, what I interviewed one of the cameramen. It was fascinating here, and he had been in the Air Force, and he said to him, it looked like a military operation. You know, so the caravan drives in. This young guy in the third car leans out of his car, sort of stands out of his car, and shoots a powder pistol into the air couple times. So there's a lot of smoke in the air. That starts everyone running from the front of the caravan, all the CWP people, right? All the people there for the rally running the other direction. All the guns were in the cars at the end of the caravan. So they're running right toward the people with the guns. The people with the guns, the people in the middle get out and have a stick fight. The people in the back, that gives them time to just go out, open the back of the car where all the guns are, start taking them out and start picking people off. And he watched it and he said this was a classic operation as far as he was concerned. I can't prove that, but it was certainly an interesting anecdote from someone who had the best seat in the house.
How was there no prosecution? I mean, how I mean, even in the South, you expect the
Two
spotlight is
two
on the South,
two
and
trials, Greg. Two
yeah, I know,
trials.
and
Two
how
criminal trials. Yeah, one state murder trial and another federal criminal civil rights trial, right? Before there's a third trial, which is very interesting. But the uh, uh, the defense attorneys were very clever, and the judge let them get away with all sorts of things, right? They said, sure, there's a video, but you can't see everything in a video. What's behind that truck over there? You can't see the tops of those trees. My clients say there were black men with shotguns in the tops of those trees. There weren't black men with shotguns in the tops of the trees, but they created enough reasonable doubt that the jury, who was more scared of communists than they were scared of Klansmen, right? I mean, we do so much in this culture to normalize the extreme right in a way. Even if we don't agree with it, we talk about the degree to which it is a part of who we are. That's true. But the sort of radical, people who've worked throughout our history to make progressive change and open up the door to greater equality are also part of our history. But they get categorized often as anti-American, at least in their time, right? And so they were more scared. It's the Cold War. These are communists. Uh, the prosecutors were very uncomfortable with defending communists. I mean, so they were uneasy about that. And so the jury said, no, we believe they acted out of patriotism, not out of racism, and probably in self-defense, and let them walk
Twice.
twice.
And like I said, watch the film. It's just
Yeah.
unreal.
Well, it
Yeah,
shows
it's
that
like what did Bill Clinton say? Who are you going to believe, me? Or you going to believe me or your lying eyes, right?
Right, right.
Yeah.
So they definitely played the red card, and this is at
Hard.
the end of Vietnam had just shut down, and we were over there trying to fight communists there, and
well, the
um,
national religion of the U.S. is anti-communism and
Yeah.
racism. That's the two. I mean,
And and
it always covers it.
and as the judge in the third trial said, you really can't pull those things apart at times, right? You know, and anti-communism was a cover for being anti-civil rights for
Yeah.
forever.
Yeah.
so a good part of your book is the detail of the first trial, acquittal, second trial, criminal, acquittal, third trial occurred, and that was a civil trial. Tell us about that.
So there are a couple significant differences when the third trial comes around. So first trial, you had the Greensboro, Guilford County District Attorney trying it, right? Second trial, it's federal prosecutors. Third trial, the plaintiffs, the Communist Workers' Party and the injured parties get to pick their own lawyers. So they've got, lawyers who trust them, believe in their cause, believe that they've got a case, uh, presenting, and some very interesting lawyers. Um, so that's one difference. The other difference is no federal judge from North Carolina would hear this. They wanted nothing to do with this case. So this amazing judge from Richmond, Virginia, named Robert Marriage, agrees to come down from Richmond and preside over this case. And this is the guy who integrated the public schools in Virginia and had to have deputy marshals protect him for 2 years and sent his children abroad to live in Spain during this time because it was so unsafe after he did that. He also admitted women to the University of Virginia. He was this very interesting guy. He could have been a great Supreme Court justice. He comes down, and one thing he does is he says, we are not going to have an all-white jury this time. The previous two trials had all-white juries, and he did not allow jurors to be struck for race. It wasn't until a year after this that the Batson case happened in the Supreme Court that made that a federal law, but he insisted on it on his own. And so all of a sudden you have an interracial jury, one black man on it, and a judge who is open to the case that the plaintiffs are making, and good lawyers making that case. And at the end of it, the jury agrees that the Klansmen, Nazis, and Greensboro police were jointly liable for death.
So you've got an OJ thing here, don't you? Where there's a brand new documentary on Netflix I haven't seen. It's another revisiting of the OJ with all of the detectives that were involved with it. All the
Interesting.
evidence that they have. So you have the criminal trial where they're, acquitted, but then finally you get the plaintiffs file the civil trial, and they win, and better attorneys, better situation. Where did the money go to? The five or the 10 that were injured? It wasn't just five killed. There were 10 seriously injured too in this.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the tricky thing about what happened in that judgment. So there was a big fight among the jurors about whether to award them anything or not. Um, the Southern jurors did not want to award them anything because they were worried that it would increase the spread of communism.
Oh God.
One white woman from the North and this black man held out, and they said, we have to award something. So they ended up awarding about $350,000 for one of the people killed, who was the only one who was not a Communist Workers' Party member at the time. But the group took that money and put it into something called the Greensboro Justice Fund and created a granting foundation to fund labor and civil rights activity all around the South. And so it still exists. I mean, it's a remarkable legacy that they use that money for.
Can you believe that the mid 80s and they're still getting they're still playing the red card in the mid 80s?
Well, that's part of the reason I wrote this book, right? Is because we like to
Unreal.
think, we can't just say, oh, we dealt with that. It's in our past. It's like, here's a stepping stone, right? And as a friend of mine said when I started working on this, he said, remember, Aaron, bad ideas travel too, not just good ideas. And, this is one of the points where the bad ideas that we're experiencing today, gets energized and is diffused again out into the culture. I mean, these guys who did the shooting in Greensboro became celebrities in the white nationalist movement. They went all over the country talking about what they did and recruiting. So, it's not like these things stay local or stay isolated. Dylan Roof, who, that horrible terrorist who walked into that church in Charleston, North Carolina,
Right.
he found inspiration in the Greensboro Massacre.
Kyle Ritter up in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Okay, you're bumming me out.
Yeah.
No,
this
no,
is
we can get to some good stuff. We can get to some good stuff. But
Okay,
yeah, it's hard.
tell me about this. Tell me about this here. When was this put up? I'm holding up a picture of the Greensboro Massacre. When you drive into Greensboro, there is a sign, Ku Klux Klan members and American Nazis on November 3rd, 1979, shot and killed 5 Communist Worker Party members 1/10 of a mile north of here. Is this a legitimate sign?
That's a state historical marker.
Unreal. And it says the
2015.
5 Communist Worker Party members.
Can you believe it?
No, I
There was
can't. I thought
well,
I thought it was like almost a Photoshop thing or something.
yeah, no.
That's an actual sign.
It was a big fight, as you can expect. But that sign went up in 2015. But what's interesting is how that became possible. And the reason that sign was possible is that in the early 2000s, the Johnsons and others who had been part of this history thought, this city, Greensboro, is still divided by this history. It is very tense here because there are the people who believe it was all the Communist Worker Party fault, and there are the people who believe there was a conspiracy between the white supremacists and the law enforcement to ruin their movement. And they said, what if we had a truth and reconciliation process in order to deal with this? And it became the first place in the United States that held a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the model of South Africa to try to process this history. And it ran from 2004 to 2006. And what's interesting is while the Greensboro's government didn't participate, civil society did. All these groups and churches and nonprofits came together to support this effort. And Klansmen came and talked publicly, police officers, the activists, community members, to tell their stories about what this meant. It's pretty extraordinary.
Greg's a prolific writer, and he published a great article yesterday in Marxist Leninist Today
Mm.
It's the Lorraine Hansberry never to be forgotten story.
Oh, neat.
Um, and Greg, I'm going to link to this article too. This is one of your better ones. Tell us about her and how this kind of ties into some of the civil rights things, the civil rights movement related to the
Well,
Morningside story.
directly because people have forgotten who Lorraine Hansberry was, is, just as they've forgotten about this incident. It's very easy to forget in America something from an accomplished communist or from idealistic youngsters who believe in communism. It's easy to forget about that. I knew the story because of my left involvement. Most of the people in this country, they heard communists were involved. They lost interest in. Didn't matter that it was the Klan. They deserve each other. That's kind of the attitude. So Aaron bringing this up is a. But I tried to bring back Lorraine Hansberry because she's remembered as a playwright, a very effective playwright. But she
Well,
was
what play? The Raisin in the Sun.
Raising
a
the
Raisin
Sun.
in the Sun, which was totally misunderstood. It was thought to be either a race play, which it really wasn't, or a non-race play, which it really wasn't either. And so she tried to explain what that was, but she's a forgotten person who grew up as a upper middle class, pretty much black person. But as she explains quite well, upper middle class in the 40s was a ghetto. It was a ghetto. You lived in a ghetto, even if you were the more privileged black people. But her interest in politics and in black liberation began in high school, continued through college, continued all through her life to the day she died. I mean, she got out of a hospital bed in 1964, just before she died in January of 65, and spoke to the Monthly Review fundraiser. And the militancy of that speech is just incredible. I mean, and you just have to go and see who she was. A tragic life we were denied because she was such a powerful, powerful voice and could have been an important voice. But I think what Pat liked about the story, and I think most people would like about it, is James Baldwin invited her to join him and some other activists in 1963 to speak to Robert Kennedy, who was then the Attorney General. And Kennedy was taken with himself. He wanted to explain to these black leading cultural figures how much we had done in the South, our Justice Department had done. And there was a young core activist who'd been beaten in the South, who Baldwin had invited. It wasn't terribly, he was very emotional about what he'd experienced. He'd been in the South and the freedom rides. And Kennedy's talking about loss, and he says, look, I was there. I saw your Justice Department people watch as we were beaten. And Kennedy was flustered. Well, how dare you talk to me that way? It went on like this, but it was Lorraine Hansberry, a rather frail woman, young black woman, who word for word met Kennedy and said, you really should listen to this young man. This is what black people are thinking. You're missing. And
Right.
he was pissed that they would come in and dare, not go along with his agenda. But she ended up walking out and thanking him for his time. But as James Baldwin said with a look that he says, I was glad she didn't ever look at me that way. She walked away. But it was a moment of confrontation that she wasn't afraid to confront. And of course, we were talking about these doctors in Greensboro, but here's a woman that was at the top of the game, won the best play, of the year,
Yeah.
and didn't stop her from defying power, from standing up to power.
Right.
We need more people like that, and we need more people with the gumption of the youngsters and young men and young women in Greensboro. I mean, we need people that are willing to take risks today. We don't have many.
And
You
calling
know,
out power too, like you.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But
Aaron, what's your
what?
thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, a couple thoughts. One is, when you look at important civil rights figures, and I include Nelson and Johnson in that. He was not
Mhm.
one of the sort of the charismatic ones that was going to promote himself as an idea leader, but he was an organizer that people came to see how he was working from everywhere. Is at some point the identity politics meets economic justice, right?
Mm.
And they begin to think about, well, we need to think bigger here in order to fix this. That's what was happening with King when he gets killed. Every one of them has to grapple with this issue and figure out how to deal with it. And that's when it gets most dangerous, right? Because that is what the FBI does not want to happen. They do
Exactly.
not want that civil rights organizing power to carry over into the economic justice and meet poor people in general to organize. And you see it all through history when Fred Hampton gets killed, when King gets killed, when these guys get, assassinated. It's a dangerous moment. And that is a big part of our history.
Yeah.
Stay in your lane,
That's a
right?
great point. It's
Yeah.
a great
Yeah.
point you make. Absolutely. It's an essential point to make because that is where the assassinations occur, generally Malcolm X and others, is
Yeah.
when
Yes,
that
exactly.
kind of realization that these things fit together beautifully and we can unite people around it. That's when they're scared. That's when the ruling circles are scared. And to back to Lorraine Hansberry for a moment, she had that all together all her life. That was the amazing thing is how she
Yeah.
connected African American liberation and communism, Marxism. I mean, the last thing she says at her speech to Monthly Review is this whole organization of this country has to be torn down. That's
Yeah.
the only real answer. And she never backed away from that. It's amazing that she and she lectured liberals like nobody ever did. I mean, I think that was like shooting fish in a barrel for her, but she had to do it.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
Yeah.
and then again, for today, what do you think about this? I mean, that's part of our problem, is it not? I mean, we have a new regime in power in the United States, and the only opposition we're allowed is a Democratic Party, and they talked about fascism on the horizon, and this man is crazy, and he's going to destroy our democracy. So he's in power now. What are they doing? Well, Schumer is aroused. He says people are aroused, and there's
Oh
nothing
gosh.
nothing happening.
I've been sending messages to so many of them, like my representatives and others, saying, okay, what do we do? What should we do? What do you want us to do?
Right.
No answer, right?
No answer. Yeah.
um,
Well,
but there aren't the ones we should be looking to figure that out. But
Yeah.
I'm interested to see what they say because, they're up there pumping their fists.
Yeah.
Um,
They're aroused.
they're
you know,
aroused, exactly.
the parallels of your book. Why I liked your first reading the book just made me mad as hell because I didn't know about this. I didn't know about the complicity of the FBI and yeah. I mean, why didn't I? That's partially I was frustrated with that. And like you said, at the time it was the third biggest FBI investigation. You had the Kennedy assassination, Pine Ridge, and then Greensboro. It was a big deal. But towards the end of the book, you wrap it up and you talk about Nelson Johnson. He reminds me a lot of Reverend William Campbell. Do you remember? Have you ever read the book
Oh,
A Brother to a Dragonfly? He was the civil rights fellow
yeah.
that was in Mississippi,
White guy. Yeah.
white guy who had compassion for the Klan. Obviously, he was very involved with the civil rights movement. Just saying, we strike out against these people and we don't understand the circumstances that created their difficulties. And I kind of thought that was the same theme towards the end when you were revisiting Nelson Johnson as he's reflecting on what happened with this event. I don't know. Do you see parallels with that or?
Absolutely. And the thing is, what wasn't Campbell a pastor too? Or
He
was
was a pastor, and one of his very famous thing is they were showing some films at one of his rallies, civil rights rallies, and they were showing films of the Ku Klux Klan coming in and swearing in, and they said turn right, and half of them turned right, and half of them turned left, and everyone laughed. And he stood up and just berated people and said, what are you doing here? Look, these people aren't educated. Why are you making fun of them? It was a similar to your article, Greg. It was one of those moments where somebody really got the last word about
Hmm.
humility, compassion, understanding is going to outweigh racism and hatred.
This is the thing, that last part of that book is so important to me as Nelson Johnson, goes from this idea with the Communist Workers' Party that the Klan needs to be exterminated to this idea that, radical love is the most powerful force of change we have, and we have to believe in the possible transformation of every human being. And this is this transformation that he makes as he goes to school, seminary, and sort of encounters this radical Jesus that he hadn't expected, and began to believe that this was a really powerful force. And so, yeah, he changes and he matures and he becomes this person who wants to bring people together. In his words, we need to walk toward each other. That's his big goal, is to get people to walk toward each other. And so I think there's a lot of that spirit in this by the end, but he doesn't give up one bit on his belief in the need for fundamental change in this country and fundamental economic change. So in that sense, he didn't really change. In his approach and openness to everyone's humanity, he did.
Yeah, calling people deplorables is not the right way to approach
No,
this. And
yeah.
It was, you mentioned you feel badly because you didn't know about this, Pat. I just watched a
I
documentary. I
felt
watched a
ashamed.
documentary this morning about Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898.
Yeah.
I didn't know about that story. I mean, that was news to me, and it has a similar thing. That's during Reconstruction, there was a substantial black middle class that evolved and developed in Wilmington. It was a working class area. There were a lot of factories in that area in North Carolina. It was a port city. It was very cosmopolitan. There was lots of black leadership, and there was the remnants of Reconstruction, blacks in positions of power. But in 1898, the city fathers, the white city fathers, the commercial people didn't want that to happen. They didn't want that to be, and they systematically set out to destroy it. And they used, the interesting thing again is they used as foot soldiers what were called the red shirts. They were Ben
Red shirts.
Tillman's
Yeah.
people from Georgia. They had to import these people to be the real killers, the real people that would go and scare the hell out of black people and kill black people in order to achieve their goals. So, and again, it's these are often they went after this one newspaper editor in Wilmington, and they would reprint his story because it had something about white women that really set white people off, white elitists off. So they try to communicate that to through the class divisions in Wilmington among whites. And they said they had to use cartoons because 25% of the whites in Wilmington were illiterate. And so again, it's a manipulation of people, working class people, of poor people, of poor whites in the South. It's a story of the South, the manipulation of
But Greg, going back to one of the things we talked about earlier, another important piece of that story was that those black elected officials in Wilmington weren't just elected by black people. That there was this
vision.
fusionist party of black and white together, and that's what they wanted to break up too. Again,
Exactly.
right? And that is, such a consistent part of our history, of creating these divisions to maintain power.
That's a good correction because that's essential to that story. Is it was the
Yeah.
fusion party of Republicans, radical Republicanism, and the African Americans, and again it was at the era of the Progressive Party,
Yeah.
which also had its contradictions in terms of racism and so on. But it took roots in the South.
Yeah, it's interesting. I often hear to that point, people talk about the progressive movement and then racism in the progressive movement as though that's in a sense, a contradiction. But the thing is, it wasn't a contradiction at the time. North Carolina had a lot of very progressive white leaders, right? Who just believed that, in segregation and believed that they shouldn't necessarily build the same schools for the black students as the white students, right? But they were progressive and they weren't corrupt. They believed in taxing and building services and providing services. So there isn't really a contradiction at that time between those things.
You know, we're wrapping up, and I have just a couple more questions. I have to ask you, what's it like to be married to Times Magazine 100 Most Influential People in 2017?
Well, Greg mentioned being humble. It keeps me humble, that's for sure.
So,
And it's awesome to be
okay,
with get to talk
your
about writing with someone who's really good at it.
yeah, your wife Margot wrote the book, which was the original diversity DEI hires, right? Tell, these are inside jokes. You are married to the person who wrote the book about hidden figures, the American Dream, the untold story of black women in mathematics, that was made into a very successful movie. And I guess her dad was involved in NASA, or was he a
He worked at NASA
mathematician?
for
Or
40 years. Yeah, he was a research scientist at NASA. And so Margot, um, these women were in her community, you know.
right, right, right.
They were her Girl Scout troop leaders and her Bible school, Bible study teachers and things like that. She never thought of them as people doing important work for NASA. And then her dad started telling these stories and it's like, holy smokes, really? And she was off to the races.
Oh, it's a great book, great movie, and it has application to where we are right now. When the planes fall out of the sky, what's the first thing that our president says? Oh my God, it's all the diverse. They had a black
Yeah.
pilot, probably. I don't know that. I just think that. Golly, give me. Oh my God. I hope, like I'm like all three of us. I just can't watch the news anymore. I just get so frustrated with it. It's just horrible. So,
Yeah, we gotta take care of our neighbors now, I think that's one of the things that, we have to pay attention to the people right around us and the undocumented people and the people who are in
right.
the headlights and do what we can for them.
Aaron, what's next? This was a good book. This really was. You spent a lot of time writing this. Very detailed, very thorough. What's next for you? Doing another one of these deep dive into an event or a person?
Yeah, I'm excited. I lived in Mexico for almost 11 years, and
Mm.
in a lot of ways, my heart's in Latin America. I wrote my first books about Cuba. Margot and I started a magazine in English in Mexico, and I want to write an interesting Mexico-U.S. World War II history that's never been told. So I'm
Oh,
excited about that.
well, come back. Come
I would
back.
love to. You guys are great.
All right. Greg, any final thoughts before I clap my
Oh, I,
hands?
I enjoyed it. I thought it was very, very enlightening, and I appreciate what you're doing. I think that's very important work. Again, it's a forgotten incident. It has the element of racism, it has the element of anti-communism, and therefore it's buried in history, and you brought it forth. So thank
Right.
you for that. I really appreciate that.
Thank you guys. Really appreciate what you do. Yeah.
Aaron, thank you so much. Bye
Thank
now.
you.